أجمعين على أمور الدنيا والدين وأصلي وأسلم على المبعوث رحمة للعالمين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. Once upon a time when Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu was the Khalifa of the Muslims, he came to meet the Wazir, the head of Mecca, outside of Mecca. So Umar ibn al-Khattab was a Khalifa and he had placed someone in charge as a deputy of his over Mecca. So he came to meet him outside of Mecca. And the very first thing he asked this man when he came to meet him was, who did you leave behind in charge of Mecca now that you're outside? Before he spoke to him about what their meeting was about or anything like that, the very first thing was, who did you leave behind? Who did you leave in charge of Mecca? So the Wazir said, Ibn Abza. Ibn Abza. So Umar ibn Khattab said, Waman ibn Abza? Who's Ibn Abza? Right, this is the time of Umar radiallahu anhu. There's a lot of Sahaba alive. There's a lot of Sahaba living in Mecca. There's Qurashis, there's many virtuous, noble companions who are still alive. And he said this name, Ibn Abza, and Umar al-Khattab, he wasn't aware of this name. He hadn't heard this name before. So the man said, Mawlan min mawalina. He's one of the freed slaves of Mecca. There's many freed slaves in Mecca, people who used to be slaves, and they are no longer slaves now. Mawlan min mawalina. He said he's one of the freed slaves of Mecca. So Umar al-Khattab now, radiallahu anhu, he says, you left behind a freed slave to be in charge of the people of Mecca? So the man said, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, إنه قارئ للقرآن وعالم بالفرائض. He said, Ibn Abza, he's a qari' of the Quran. And we're going to talk about what this word meant at that time and what it means nowadays. He said, Ibn Abza, this freed slave who I left behind in charge of the city of Mecca, he's a qari' of the Quran, and he's a scholar when it comes to the science of inheritance, fara'id, which is one of the more difficult sciences, right? The rules regarding al-fara'id are pretty straightforward, but the issue is when you actually have to apply the rules and apply the maxims and the principles to the actual situation that you have at hand. That's where it becomes tricky, and that's where it becomes difficult, and that's why people who are very good in fara'id, they are considered to be very knowledgeable in the religion of Islam. So his argument for Umar ibn Khattab, his argument to the Amir al-Mu'mineen was that this person, he's a qari of the Quran. And at that time, the word qari meant that this person was a scholar of the Quran. It's not someone who just has a nice voice, or someone who just has memorized the Quran. Oh, my son is hafiz, this brother is hafiz. You know, you meet the brother, before you even ask him anything about himself, the other guy says, oh, he's hafiz, by the way. Oh, I'm hafiz. Ya akhi, right? It's something that it bothers me a bit, you know. Person says, Assalamu alaikum, kayf al-hal, what's your name, how you doing? Right? Before you even get to know the person, either they themselves or someone else jumps in and says, oh, he's hafiz, by the way. Right? It's a bit unnecessary, right? And sometimes it points towards some of the other intentions that are involved when someone is hafiz or memorizes the Quran and things like that, you know. So, qari back in the day, a qari was someone who was, of course, memorized the entire Quran, knew the tafsir, the meanings of the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, knew the ahkam, the rulings that are all derived, all the fiqh books that you see, the hadith books, right? They're an explanation of the rulings and the verses found in the Quran, the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he's also a scholar of the science of inheritance. So Umar ibn Khattab, when he heard this, he said, indeed, I heard your messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam saying, إن الله لا يرفع بهذا الكتاب أقواما ويضع به آخرين. He said, when the man told him that this free slave, the reason why I left him in charge is because he's a scholar of the Quran and of the religion of Islam, and he's a specialist in the science of inheritance. I left him in charge of the people of Mecca. Umar bin Khattab, he submitted to the decision of this man. And he said, verily I heard your messenger say, meaning back during the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I heard the messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam with my own ears saying, Inna Allah la yarfa'u bihadha al-kitabi aqwaman. That verily, the Prophet ﷺ said, indeed, surely Allah will raise some people through this book. وَيَضَعُ بِهِ آخَرِينَ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will also bring down and debase some people because of this book or through this Quran. This man who used to be a slave, right? And when you hear the word slave or slavery, right? Because of the modern day and the world we live in, we think of certain things, right? But if you look at the books of fiqh and you read the rulings of slavery and how the person must be treated and what they can do and what they can't do, wallahi, you think, subhanAllah, this guy's living a better life than me. Right? This person's got more rights than me. Right? So this person used to be a slave and then he was emancipated. Right? He got his freedom and he had knowledge of the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And because of that, he was chosen to be put in charge of Mecca al-Mukarramah, the place where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has sworn over or sworn by in several verses in the Quran. لا أقسم بهذا البلد والتين والزيتون وطور سينين وهذا البلد. He was put in charge, even though it was just for a period of time, over this blessed city. Right? Imagine if you were given a day or two to be in charge of Mecca al-Mukarramah, to be the person who was, tasked by looking over the affairs of the people of this holy city. What type of honor is that? So, the point behind this hadith, which is collected by Imam al-Bukhari and other collectors of hadith, is that this book, brothers and sisters and respected uncles, this book, this Quran, is the reason why a lot of people in this world, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has blessed them. And although they may not be people who have a lot of fame or a lot of notoriety, or they may not be so popular, but because of their connection to the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala raises them here in this dunya. And this is just in this dunya, let alone what's ready for them and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prepared for them in the akhirah. So this reminder is for myself and for everyone. As the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam clearly says, وَالْقُرْآنُ حُجَّةٌ لَكَ أَوْ عَلَيْكَ. In Islam, we don't have this thing where, the Quran, the hadith, the holy books, that's for the shuyukh. The shuyukh, they'll read it for us, they'll explain it to us, they will look at it, and of course, generally speaking, we look at the scholars, and the scholars are the one who teach us the speech of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we learn through ijazas and asanid and things like that, chains of transmission. But at the end of the day, every single Muslim has to have an individual connection to the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because the Prophet says, وَالْقُرْآنُ حُجَّةٌ لَكَ أَوْ عَلَيْكَ. The Quran will be a proof for you or against you. It's not just going to be a proof for or against the sheikh or the imam or the khatib or the one who knows. No, every single individual. What steps did you take with the resources that Allah gave you? What steps did you take towards the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in your life with the resources that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to judge you based on your situation and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decreed for you. وَالْقُرْآنُ حُجَّةٌ لَكَ أَوْ عَلَيْكَ. The Quran will either be a proof for us on the Day of Judgment or a proof against us. And when we talk about the Quran and being connected to the Quran and having the Quran as a proof for us, the very first thing naturally that we think of is the recitation of the Quran. Right? Everyone might be thinking now, okay, khalas, I have to get back to my wird. I remember I used to read 1 juz a day. Now I'm going to get back to it. That's the very first thing we think of naturally. But before that, there's many aspects of being connected to the Quran that are not related to its recitation. Do you live a life? Are you living a life based on the rules and regulations set out by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran. Right? The scholars, they talk about abandoning the Quran. Especially when they talk about the verse in Surah Al-Furqan, وَقَالَ الرَّسُولُ يَا رَبِّي إِنَّ قَوْمِ اتَّخَذُوا هَذَا الْقُرْآنَ مَهْجُورًا. The scholars of tafsir, they talk about the different levels and degrees of abandoning the Quran. And they all mention that the last point or the last level of abandoning the Quran is not reading the Quran. While we think that the very first thing is not reading the Quran. But there's so many steps before that. Like we said, the ahkam, the halal, the haram in the Quran. Right? When there's an issue, where do we go back to? Do we go back to the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or do we go back to the words of someone else? Right? Do we go to the Quran for shifa? Right? When we are looking for remedy and cure, do we turn to the Quran, where as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, that the Quran is a shifa for the mu'mineen? Right? These are the different degrees of abandoning the Quran. So this reminder for myself and for everyone is just for us, inshallah, nujaddid. We can, inshallah, restart our connection to the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on an individual basis. Right? Understanding first and foremost that I am going to be questioned, I am going to be held accountable by my Lord, by my Creator, about my connection to His book, to the Quran al-Kareem. Right? Does that make sense, inshallah? Barakallahu feekum, jazakumullah khairan. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from Ahl al-Quran. اللهم اجعلنا من أهل القرآن الذين هم أهلك وخاصتك. اللهم اجعلنا من أهل القرآن. اللهم اجعلنا من أهل القرآن. اللهم اجعلنا من أهل القرآن. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين وجزاكم الله خيرا.